Hours. Hey guys, Pastor Tanner here with some more interactive office hours, and hopefully gonna finish the sermon up today. Maybe not, but hopefully. Also, I'm gonna have to leave early. I can't stay until noon because we have an appointment that we have to get to, and so I can only probably go a couple hours today instead of the full 3. But yeah, hoping to make some good progress. Hoping to interact with you guys, and we'll have a good session here. So I've been going through this series here, and I think I came up with 2 good points on the 2 good ideas on the first main point. And so I'm going to come up with a little bit of application here and go from there. And then I'll move into points 2 and 3. I think it's going to be more of a straightforward sermon than I've done recently, which is nice. Sometimes people need that. Wifey made lemon bars last night, so really enjoying those. Alright, so far I'm talking about the 12, how Jesus is sent to Israel. Then I'm going to talk about Luke 10:72. Luke 10, not verse 72, but Luke 10, where Jesus sends out 72, and that means he is going to all the nations. And that brings us to our first application. Jesus is for everyone, both Israel and all the nations. The second thing is that we're given the authority of Jesus. We can see that in 2 ways. First, they're sent out, apostolane. That's where you get the phrase apostle from. And so they're given a certain amount of authority. And then Luke 10:16 makes it clear that we are delegates. So let's see, was it Luke 10:16? Yeah, we're given authority of him. Whoever listens to you listens to me. Whoever rejects you rejects me. But whoever rejects me rejects him who sent me. You've got that parallel between whatever we do, Jesus does, essentially. We should take that very seriously. Rafe on YouTube says, hi there. Hello, Rafe. Good to see you this morning, brother. So this hasn't changed. We are still Jesus delegates. But we're in a different day and age. So let's see what he sent them out to do. Gave them authority over impure spirits. They drive out many demons, anoint many sick people with oil, and heal them. And they preach that people should repent. Yeah, because I'm going to be getting into the details later of the principles that we need to follow. So, I don't need to go into it here. Here, I just need to talk about the authority structure doesn't change. Is there a good illustration of somebody being a representative or a delegate? I guess your stereotypical is like a consulate, vassal, something like that. I forget what that governmental representative is called. A foreign official. What is their name? Ambassador. Thank you, Rafe. An ambassador. And I can tell people, we all understand the idea of an ambassador. If while the ambassador is overseas, he acts in a certain way, it is perceived as though the entire nation is acting in that way. So too, we as Christians are ambassadors for Christ, 2 Corinthians 5, and we need to see to it act in a manner that Christ would. You don't want to be a bad representative. So I like that. I feel like that fills out this and I'm actually going to do a follow-up because this sounds eerily like do better, right? If I tell people act in a manner that Christ would. It's just kind of like I'm telling them, do better, be a better Christian. And we never want to present Christianity that way because it's not the gospel. And so I'm going to follow up with love Christ. Because that will help you to act in a manner that's consistent. Cool. Rafe says, right. Yeah. It's so difficult in Christian sermons to not just say things like do better, improve, be better. Because the scriptures are often moral, but Christianity itself as a system isn't moral. And so I don't want to portray it that way. And then I'll get to mention the fact that there's a challenge associated with all of this, right? There's a fundamental challenge that we'll always face when it comes to this idea. And the answer is going to be trusting in God is difficult. Too many lyrics on this. I'm skipping. I don't like this one either. Trusting God. So let's look at verses 8 and 9 closely. Make sure they're teaching this. Yeah, that's the principle he's essentially teaching, is to trust God. Oh, I'm on my notes from my Bible study. I was like, why is this all in here? There you go. Man, these artists remind me of Sampha, but he's not Sampha. That's interesting. Today's message is no different than ours, but it's even wider reaching, I think. Let's look back at my notes. Jesus goes to all the tribe of the Israel. Salvation, historical situation, invading Satan's kingdom. So we need to remember that. And so we should expect spiritual warfare as well. I think what I'm going to do is put this down here. Man, I like how a lot of these songs start and then they just get too fired up for me. It's like I'm not there, guys. I can't jam that hard. Rafe, did you make more progress on your sermon? Let's see what my Exodus 12:11 quote was for. Went to the wrong spot. So I think this idea of how they should eat has a couple ideas locked up within it. First is the idea of mobility. He's sending them out, so need to be mobile and not bogged down. And then I can relate that to Exodus 12:11, where they ate the Passover with ready to move, essentially. So there's an element of mobility, but there's also an element of trust. So because it's multiple ideas, I'm going to actually put this up front. And so I can say, I think there's several elements to this idea. The first is mobility. Blah, 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 blah. We too have to be mobile with the gospel. Actually, I won't go to this first, I'll go to the second. First, I'm going to talk about asceticism in the negative. Hey, this is not what Jesus means. Let's first talk about what Jesus doesn't mean. Rafe says, yes, I did, however, but I think my homiletical idea from the passage is God wants us to act like Christians instead of Cretans. I have an exegetical outline I made from the Greek. I have to write my exposition now. Things are going better, but I'm still not comfortable with the process. That sounds pretty good, Rafe, though. And you're well ahead of schedule, right? Because you're not preaching this Sunday, but next Sunday. So that's pretty nice as well. Reason I left you in Crete was that you might put order what was left unfinished. I kind of like that, Rafe. And I think that Cretan idea, you might want to reference, you probably are already going to, but you might want to reference that passage where Paul kind of uses it pejoratively. Yeah, it's just further on into verse 12. So you might skip forward to verse 12, and one of Crete's own prophets said, Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, and lazy gluttons. This saying is true. You might want to pull that, although that might bring in more exegetical baggage. Oh, you said you did it last time too. Yeah, that's cool. I like that. I like that idea then too. Act like Christians, not Cretans. That's a really good one. Good proposition. Now, there are two halves to a proposition like proposition like that, right? Because something is true, we should do something, right? So because you might want to, because you might have a little bit of time proving this as well, you might want to say your full proposition might want to be something to the effect of, because God's standards for elders are actually standards for all Christians, we should all act like Christians, not Cretans. Something like that. You might want to word it differently, but you want to get that because, right, in front of it as well, if possible. Because your first statement is essentially what we should do. And you're wedding two ideas. What is true, what we should do, right? What is true, what we should do. And so that you've got the what we should do. We should act like Christians, not Cretans. But what is true that makes that the case? Oh, what's true is that elders have standards because they are supposed to be model Christians. And model Christians are, of course, model Christians. Therefore, we should follow their model, their example. So something like that I think would be helpful. But that's good. I like it, Rafe. I think it'll go really well. Cool. Christian life not ultimately about denying yourself. I need to clarify that. How would I go into this? It's not about asceticism. Not ultimately about, maybe just suffering. I'll put suffering. And I can clarify, sometimes our lives will be full of suffering, but those situations come into our life given by God to conform us to the image of Christ. But if we're going about, so an application will be, don't manufacture suffering. If we're going in our lives about trying to almost make ourselves suffer because we think that's godly or Christian, we've got it wrong. Jesus might have suffering for us, and that's fine, but it's given to us by Him because of His wise counsel. I kind of like the song. Has some spiritual themes to it as well. So that'll be an application. Instead, verses 8 and 9 are about mobility. And trust. So those are the two lessons we need to learn from these challenges. The challenges are being mobile enough with the gospel and to trust God. Mobility and trust. Rafe says, okay, I'm trying to get what you suggested. Because God's standard has standards of conduct for elders, all of us should act like Christians instead of Cretans. I'm unsure how to wed those ideas. No, Rafe, I'm thinking something more along the lines of this. Close. It's close. Because God's standards for elders... This is going to be too long and wordy, but I'm going to flesh out the whole idea for you. Because God's standard for elders are also his standards for all Christians, we should... And so your emphasis is going to be on the all here, right? You're going to have to make a leap. This is something you're going to have to prove to people. You don't have to do this. It's just an idea I had. Because God's standards for elders are also his standards for all Christians, we should all act like... And it may not be Christians instead of Cretans. Although, you got to love the alliteration there, right? But we should all act like elders rather than Cretans. Again, you can word this differently. You don't even have to use it, right? But I think this is more along the lines of what I would do. It has an implicit statement in there that I have to prove, right? I have to prove that God's standards for elders are also his standards for all Christians. And so I'd be talking about this stuff, but not only that, there'd be some sort of proof in there of, hey guys, this isn't just some abstract for you to select leaders from. Your elders are supposed to set an example for you, and you're supposed to live in light of their same example. And so you too, when you read these, not only are you selecting an elder over yourself, you're selecting somebody over yourself that is setting an example for you, and he's living how you ought to live. And so this is more the direction I think I would go. Because God's standards for elders are also his standards for all Christians, we should all act like elders rather than Cretans. Something like that. Of course, you lose the beautiful alliteration, so you may want to reword it. But this is roughly the idea I would go with. Something like that. It's close to yours, but yours just only has half of it. That's all. That's my only point, is yours, again, according to Chapel, what is true, what to do. What is true, what to do. And yours is mostly what to do. We should act like Christians rather than Cretans. Why, though? Why should I listen to you? Why should I act like a Christian rather than a Cretan? There's something that's true that would indicate that I should act like a Christian rather than a Cretan. So what's the because, right? Because something is true, fill in the blank, right? Because that, we should act like Christians rather than Cretans. And here's my best shot at it. What is true, what to do. So I've got mobility here. And then I've also got trust. And trust is the heart of what this means. Trust in God, rely on him when things get tough. And then we've got 10, 11, and 12. 10, 11, and 12. And they lay themselves out pretty nicely, actually, which is cool. Verse 10. Rafe says, I'm not sure I could prove that from the text about talking about elders. I need to think differently. Okay, thanks. Yeah, no problem. And maybe it doesn't go this way. But you still need to have a what is true to go in there. And it might be something as simple as, maybe you feel like this is overstating it. God's standards for elders are God's standard for all Christians. Maybe you want to back off on that a little bit and say something along the lines of, because elders are meant to be our examples, we should all... So maybe that, because elders are meant to be our examples, we should all act like Christians rather than Cretans. So rather than way overstating it, God's standard for elders are His standard for all Christians, maybe it's elders are meant to be our examples. That's something that would almost be like self-evident to people. I think a lot of people would accept that. And maybe it's neither of these ideas, right? Maybe you do something as broad as, because the church is Christ. Well, let me. I was going to say because the church is Christ's witness to the world. But let's read the text real quick. Reason I left you in Crete was that you might put in order everything that was left unfinished and appoint elders in every town, as I directed you. So Titus is building the church, right? And then here's the standard. An elder must be blameless, faithful to one wife, man whose children believe and are not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. Since an overseer manages God's household, he must be blameless, not overbearing, not quick-tempered, blah, blah, blah. Rather, he must be hospitable, one who loves, what is good, one who is self-controlled. He must hold firmly to the trustworthy message as has been taught, so that he can encourage others by sound doctrine and refute those who oppose it. So there's an aspect of building churches, and then there's also an aspect of standing for sound doctrine and refuting the outsiders, right? Amidst all of the standards, right? So this might work because the church is God's plan to witness to the nations. So because the church is God's plan to the witness to the nations, we should act like Christians rather than Cretans. How do I know that's God's plan to witness to the nations? Well, the reason I left you in Crete was you might appoint what was left unfinished and appoint elders in every town. Paul wants him to build churches. That's his goal. Why? What do churches do? Well, they proclaim the message, they encourage others with sound doctrine, and they can refute those who oppose it. And here are the standards of the leaders you set up in those churches. Oh, by the way, those standards are the standards we should all follow, because they give us examples of how we as Christians should act instead of acting like Cretans. Something like that. So that's what I would go with, Rafe. Something along those lines. I'll leave these up here in the corner so you can think about them. But, yeah. I've got a new person on Mixer, Kat Hapley. Kat says, what's the thesis statement of this sermon? Really good question, Kat. This is my formal proposition. Because the challenges of gospel proclamation are timeless, we should apply the timeless gospel principles today. That's what I'm going with. If you heard me talking about all this other stuff, I'm helping Rafe work through his sermon on Titus as well. Just giving him some ideas. And so that's what all these are. These are independent of my actual sermon that I'm going to be preaching this Sunday. But the sermon I'm preaching this Sunday, Kat, is the thesis statement is because the challenges of gospel proclamation are timeless, we should apply the timeless gospel principles today. That's where I'm going. And my three main points are going to be the commissioning of the disciples, the challenges they faced, i.e. the challenges of gospel proclamation being timeless. Hey, we suffer these same challenges. And finally, the principles. And then I'm going to outline how we should approach gospel proclamation. So that's what I'm going with. I have a feeling already the song is going to get too big. I'm okay with it so far. It felt like it was going to get big. I kind of like it, but... So verse 10, verse 11, and verse 12. And so I think point number 3 is going to come together very nicely because the text lends itself to that. Kat, if you're wondering as well, I'm preaching out of Mark chapter 6, verses 6b through 12. Let's see. This is the text I'm preaching out of. Then Jesus went around teaching from village to village. Calling the 12 to him, he began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over impure spirits. These were his instructions: take nothing for the journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in your belts. Wear sandals, but not an extra shirt. Whenever you enter a house, stay there until you leave that town. And if any place will not welcome you or listen to you, leave that place, shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them. Then they went out and preached that people should repent. They drove out many demons and anointed many sick people with oil and healed them. So this is the text I'm going to be preaching out of Cat. And again, here's my proposition. So mobility and trust are the 2 challenges. Now this is a challenge a little different for us today, because we are more mobile. And one would think that would actually make us more... That would make the gospel more, like, easier to communicate, I guess. If mobility was a challenge for them, and it's less of a challenge for us, it's actually a great strength we have in gospel proclamation. Less of a challenge, but one nonetheless. Less, but one nonetheless. I don't know if that'll be confusing for people. Missions. This is missions oriented. And it's hold the rope or go down into the well. Oh, the space I put in is... Rafe's still working on his sermon on Titus. He says this: how is this? Because leaders in the church are God's appointed means of caring for his household, they must be a model in their character, or something like that. So now you're taking what I assumed, you're taking essentially what I assumed here, you're taking this and you're making it the whole. You're making it the whole proposition. You're taking my first half of the proposition, you're making it the whole one. Because God's standards for elders are his standards for all Christians. Instead of assuming it like I do in the statement, you're stating it explicitly. Because leaders in the church are God's appointed means of caring for his household, they must be a model in their character. That's close, but it only gives the leaders something to do, right? To model in their character. The way it's stated makes it sound like the text is about them and what they should do. And you want to apply it. Well, you might be able to do that. They should be a model in their character. The problem is it just right off the front of things, it doesn't give me something to do, right? So I would almost just word it like this, the second half. Not they must be a model in their character, but we must follow their example in character. You see what I mean? Like we must follow the example they set, or something like that. It's very, very close, very similar to that idea. Yeah, if possible, Rafe, have it apply to everyone rather than just them. So... And then in your sermon with your main points, Because leaders in the church are God-appointed means of caring for his household, instead of they must be a model in their character, we must follow their example of character. Something like that. Got a new interaction on YouTube. Rhett Quigley says, the Eucharist is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. Malachi 1:11 is the sacrifice of the Catholic Mass. 1 Corinthians 10:16, 11:27, John 6:54, Luke 22:19, etc. Jesus is the new lamb. I agree that Jesus is our new sacrificial lamb. Let's check Malachi real quick. My name will be great among the nations, from where the sun rises to where the sun sets. In every place incense and pure offerings will be brought to me, because my name will be great among the nations. That's awesome. Yeah, I like that verse a lot, and it has a lot of emphasis on what will be coming in the new covenant, right? In the old covenant, Israel was God's people, but in the new covenant, people from all the nations will worship God. And so I like that a lot. 1 Corinthians 10:16, etc. Jesus is the new lamb. Absolutely. There's a sharp change, Rhett, in the New Testament, where we go from God's people being one nation, i.e. Israel, to now God going to select people from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. And I love Malachi 1:11 and how it speaks to that. So very good verse. Thank you for sharing. Appreciate that. So I got my idea of mobility. But I also need to point out that we can be creative in how we deal with mobility. And I wonder if we have an embarrassment of riches in the mobility that we have today. Oh, that won't fit in there. I'm gonna have to go. Because we have not only planes, trains, automobiles, right? But we also have the internet, different ways. The mobility that we have in terms of reaching other cultures and societies is huge for the gospel. And so how can we be creative about that? So I think that'll be a good talking point as well. Now the second aspect is trust. How can we trust in God in this difficult time? Ooh, it's not coming out how I want it. Got a new interaction on Mixer. Emil says, maybe trust is a comparison with other events. We trust in something more than in other trials. Maybe trust is in comparison. I like that, Emil. That'll make for a really good illustration. I'm going to write that down. Illustration. My illustrations are in pink. Trust compared to other events. I think what that's going to do, Emil, is it's going to make this concept that I'm talking about, trust, I think it's going to make it pop for people. They'll be like, oh, I trust a seatbelt. I trust a parachute. How can I trust God in the same way, right? So I think that's a really good point, Emil. Maybe trust is in comparison with other events. We trust in something more than in other trials. Yeah, I think that'll be helpful. don't know if I'm going to talk about teamwork yet. I still have to think about that one. Rafe's got another attempt at his proposition. Let's see what he's got. Rafe says, because leaders in the church are God's appointed means of caring for his household, all Christians must follow their example of character. I like that. Because leaders in the church are God's appointed means of caring for his household, all Christians must follow their example of character. I like that a lot, Rafe. Now here's the other thing, and I know I pushed you to this. Here's the other question. Is this too long and wordy, right? Sometimes they end up getting to be this long and wordy and there's nothing you can do. But consider if you can pare it down at all and make it simpler for people to understand with the same ideas. Maybe you can't. Maybe you can't. But I like this one a lot, Rafe, because what it does is it includes all the elements of your text. We've got leaders in the church are God's appointed means of caring for his household. That was in Titus, right? That was verse 6, was it? 5? Yeah. I left you to do this so you could appoint elders in every town. So that is explicitly, this is explicitly talked about in verse 5. So you can talk about that. And then also, all Christians must follow their example of character. What is their example of character? Oh, it's the rest of the passage, 6 through 8. And then you can talk about these aspects as well that are important. Rafe says, I will try. Yeah, now how do I prove it? So I would prove it. I would talk about 3 main points. I would say, 1, let's do this for now. 3 main points. 1, something like God's appointed means. And you can emphasize elders. You say leaders here. Maybe you use the term elders. I don't know. Depends on the leadership in your church, maybe, huh? So, God's appointed means, and I would emphasize, I would go to verse 5, and I would emphasize the fact, look, Paul left Titus behind so he could do this very thing, because establishing an authority structure in the church was essential. And I would talk to, this is God's plan, this is his purpose. I would talk to his plan and purpose structuring the church. You can get into a lot of details, right, that you can flesh out regarding this idea. I mean, this first half of your statement is almost self-evident, but because it's not quite, you can go into some more details describing it and try to get some better ideas surrounding it. So I would flesh this out in a lot of detail. And then all Christians must follow their example of character. I would say something like, now here's where you can go to some other passages, right? So you might want to bring in, I believe it's Hebrews that I'm thinking of. Let's just try it. I think it's Hebrews 12 or 13. Where it talks about following your leaders. Right here. 13:7. Remember your leaders who spoke the word of God to you. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. Look how helpful that cross-reference would be for you, Rafe. See, it's evident in your passage, but if you go to other passages, is even more evident, right? And so you could quote this verse, Hebrews 13:7, and say, look, the author of Hebrews tells us to consider the outcome of their way of life and to imitate their faith. What is their faith? What's the outcome of their way of life? Well, Paul tells us in Titus 1. He gives us the way they live their lives. They're blameless. They're faithful to their wife. They're a man whose children believe and they're not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient, etc. So I think those are some details you could go into. Number 2 would then be follow So number 2 would be something like follow their example. And that's where I would quote Hebrews 13:7, right? So it's God's appointed means. This is verse 5. Then follow their example. 13:7. So you're just here proving the principle that we are to follow their example. Finally, point number 3 could maybe be the specifics of their example. And this is where you could go into verses 6 through, I forget what it is, we'll just put 10. I don't think it's 10, but... And so those could be kind of some of your 3 points there, Rafe. Rafe says, wow, thanks, it's coming together. Yeah, and again, Rafe, you don't have to follow any of what I'm outlining here, but given what you've told me thus far, this is probably the direction I would go with it. You could spend a lot of time on each of these things, and then verses 6 through 9. I put 10, but it's 9. This gives you a ton of application, right? Because you've proven up front, these are your leaders, this is how they act, and you're supposed to imitate them. Now you have a ton of application. Look at how they live. They do this. We should live similarly. They do this. We should live similarly. And you could have a lot of application based upon that. I think that would work. Again, you don't have to follow my example, Rafe. It's just something I thought of based on what you were telling me. Emil on Mixer says, sometimes I wonder, how can we compare our trust in God with respective faiths? Sometimes I'm confused because there are many different versions of trust in God or even Christianity. Emil, that's a great question, and it's a big question, right? I'm going to try to think about it for a second here. How can we compare our trust in God with respective faiths? Emil, you've reminded me of something, and so I'm just going to go there for right now. Emil, I don't know if you've heard about Timothy Keller, but he wrote a book called The Reason for God, and he has a very interesting word picture to describe this. Let me get there. Hold on, I'm going to find it. I haven't read this book for a while. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to look for elephant because I know what I'm looking for is an illustration about an elephant. Right there. So, Emil, here is a book called The Reason for God, Belief in an Age of Skepticism, and it's written by Timothy Keller, and the whole first chapter is on the idea that there can't be just one true religion. And so I'd encourage you to get this book and read this whole first chapter. It's very, very enlightening. But this is what you reminded me of. You asked, how can we compare our trust in God with respective faiths? Sometimes I'm confused because there are many different versions of trust in God or even in Christianity. And here, I think, is a good illustration of that. Here, it says, sometimes the point is illustrated with the story of a blind man and the elephant. Several blind men were walking along and came upon an elephant that allowed them to touch and feel it. This creature is long and flexible like a snake, said the first blind man, holding the elephant's trunk. Not at all. It is thick and round like a tree trunk, said the second blind man, feeling the elephant's leg. No, it is large and flat, said the third blind man, touching the elephant's side. Each blind man could only feel part of the elephant. None could envision the entire elephant. In the same way, it is argued, the religions of the world each have a grasp on part of the truth about spirituality, but none can see the whole elephant or claim to have a comprehensive vision of the truth. This illustration backfires on its users. The story is told from the point of view of someone who is not blind. How could you know that each blind man only sees part of the elephant unless you claim to be able to see the whole elephant? There's an appearance of humility in the protestation that the truth is much greater than any one of us can grasp. But if this is used to invalidate all claims to discern truth, it is in fact an arrogant claim to a kind of knowledge which is superior to all others. We have to ask, what is the absolute vantage ground from which you claim to be able to relativize all the absolute claims these different scriptures make? How could you possibly know that no religion can see the whole truth unless you yourself have the superior, comprehensive knowledge of spirituality that you claim none of the religions have? So this discussion points out the fact that if somebody wants to say, you can't have all the truth, nobody has all the truth, but all different religions see only part of the truth, this invalidates that argument by saying, well, you can't claim to know that unless you have all the truth to begin with. And so that's a very, very strong point, I think. Emil asks, are you supportive of other faiths? Depends on what you mean by that, Emil. I am supportive of the fact that other faiths and faith groups exist. I'm supportive of their I don't know how to put this, their right to exercise their faith in a way that they see fit. I don't know that I would impose upon them. And I also think this is a different claim than this tree trunk one, right, or this elephant trunk one. I would claim this. I think most religions in the world have some element of truth to them. I think most religions in the world have some element of truth to them. But I think only Christianity has all of the truth, if that makes sense. So I think most religions have some element of truth, but I think only Christianity has all of the truth. And I believe that because I believe the Bible is the Word of God. And we can ground our trust and our faith in the Bible. That's the direction I would go with that. But I'm happy to... I think there are truths in other religions, and I'm happy to go there and talk with them and think about it, and I'm also happy to interact with them and hear what they have to say, because they might be able to tell me a truth or give me information that I previously didn't have. This is not me arrogantly claiming that because I'm a Christian, I have all the truth. That's not what I mean. But I believe that only Christianity can make sense of all of the facts as we have them, if that makes sense. It's a big question, Emil. I'm trying my best to answer it. Let me know if that helps or if you need me to clarify more. Good question. Emil says, because we have the Constitution protecting freedom of religion in a pluralistic nation, but I also see the Satanic Temple is rising through that same right. That's right, Emil, and that's one of the issues, is that we have a Constitution protecting freedom of religion in a pluralistic nation, and I think that's good. I think it's good to protect freedom of religion and that we shouldn't force others to practice a religion they don't believe in, but there's a way to balance all of that, right? There's a way to balance all of those things and to be charitable towards other religions without being affirming of them in a way of pluralistic way of saying that there is no absolute truth, right? If your tolerance of other religions is saying, oh, they're all true, they're all equally true, well, that's self-evidently false, and so that's not the case. But we should be tolerant in the sense that we allow others to practice their religions so far as it doesn't infringe on other people's rights as well. So it's a difficult concept, but I think that makes sense. Rafe says this about what I was talking about earlier. He says, all truth is God's truth, so God's truth is in some ways in other religions, just not saving truth. Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it, Rafe. Christianity has the saving gospel of Jesus Christ, and that's the essential aspect of Christianity. But other religions have some elements of that truth in them as well, because we're all made in the image of God, and so we can't help but represent that. These songs are too big for me. Let's try groovy music. Let's see what groovy music has for us. Let's see how this goes. Emil says, according to the Constitution, it means that Satanists can put up monuments next to our own if we are to uphold the Constitution. Yeah, and that's where it becomes difficult, right, Emil? Because we want to be open, we want to give people freedom to practice religions, but there are some religions that a lot of people would describe as being out of bounds, right? Now, I would say that we should only put a religion in the category of out of bounds like that if they're practicing something that as a society we deem to be against our moral code or our ideals as a society. So, for example, if they just call themselves Satanists, I may not be happy about it, but I respect their right and their freedom to practice that religion. But if their religion involves, and I'm not saying Satanists do this, I know very little about Satanism, but if their religion involves sacrificing babies, for example, then we would put up boundaries on that. We'd say this is not okay because it's violating the rights of other human beings and other citizens, right? And so to me that seems to be a decent way to handle the situation. So now what's going on in our day and age is we're post-Christian, right? So that can be difficult for people. Post-Christian. And that might be discouraging and difficult for Christians. So how can we trust God in a post-Christian society or a post-Christian age? How can we trust in God in a post-Christian society or a post-Christian age? I think it's at this point that I want to bring up some examples. God is in control and has a plan. And I'm thinking about verses like where Elijah is so discouraged, and then God tells him, I have 500 who haven't bowed the knee to Baal, right? I'm thinking about some verses like that to just point out the fact that God is in control and has a plan. There's been a lot of periods during redemptive history where it looked like you couldn't trust God, and yet He came through every time, and He will continue to come through. Emil says, how can we say it is a post-Christian society if we are Christians ourselves? That would imply we are not existing. It's a good question, Emil. I think that we can say post-Christian because we're not talking about individuals, but we're talking about what I'll call, I'm going to borrow a term from Charles Taylor here, the social imaginary of the society. Let's do a little digging into what a social imaginary is, and I think this will help us to recognize this. So let's go Wikipedia. And let me zoom in on this. Imaginary sociology. The imaginary or social imaginary is the set of values, institutions, laws, and symbols common to a particular social group and the corresponding society through which people imagine their social whole. The concept of the imaginary has attracted attention in anthropology, sociology, philosophy, and media studies. So it's the common set of values, institutions, laws, and symbols common to a particular group and the corresponding society through which they imagine their social whole. Okay? So when I say we're a post-Christian society, I don't mean that there are no Christians. I mean that the social imaginary of the society has shifted from Christianity to something else. There was a point in America's history where the majority of Americans were Christian, or at least believed in the values, institutions, laws, and symbols that Christianity indicated. And I believe we are in a post-Christian society now where there are still Christians, but they are in the minority when it comes to their set of values, institutions, laws, and symbols that they believe in. The society as a whole believes in something different, and specifically, it has come out of this framework of Christianity. America was Christian, and now it has moved beyond that. And so, and I don't mean beyond that in a good way, right? I mean, it feels like it no longer needs Christianity or the gospel, and there's a lot of problems associated with that. And so the question is, how can we, in a society or a nation that is after Christianity, Christianity has already come and gone, how can we tell people that we need to return to Christianity when they see that as not progress, but a regression to a lesser history, right? That's what I mean by post-Christian, Emil. Does that help? I think that helps clarify a little bit where I'm coming from. Rafe says the society is no longer Christian, but some individuals are. Exactly, Rafe. That's what I'm getting at. If that helps, Emil, the society is no longer Christian. It doesn't act Christian, though there are some individuals who are still Christian within the society. Emil says, I don't see an atheist or a Satanist ever winning a U.S. election. They'd be defined as non-Christian. Them being non-Christian would become their defining factor. Therefore, I think we are still a very strong Christian majority society. It's an interesting viewpoint, Emil, and I like it for what it's worth. I do not like pessimistic views of the future of Christianity, pessimistic views of the world around us. And what you're declaring here is a very optimistic view of America and the U.S. You say, I don't see an atheist or Satanist ever winning a U.S. election. They'd be defined as non-Christian, and that would be their defining factor. I think we're still a very strong Christian majority society. I'd be willing to grant that, Emil. I think that's a very interesting idea. It'll be interesting to see how this next election goes, but I think there's some truth to what you're saying. But I do think in the West in general, people are moving more and more progressively away from Christianity, and we need to have a strong message to bring people back to see that idea. Here's the other thing, Emil, when I'm putting this point together. I'm trying to exegete my audience, Emil, and the perspective you just described is one that I think is rare among Christians. I actually like it quite a bit, an optimistic view of America still has a strong Christian principles and still a strong Christian foundation, but I find that in individual churches, I run into a lot of people who are pessimistic about America, the way America's going, and the values that America holds to. And so in me bringing out this point, even if I don't personally feel this way, I want my audience to recognize I understand what they're feeling, and I want to give them hope for the future. But I like your perspective on this, Emil, and I think that generally I would put myself more in kind of that camp or that idea that is optimistic about Christianity's future in the West. But I know that wouldn't be the majority position of members of my church. And so I want to address them where they're at and give them some hope, right? Very, very good points. I appreciate your interaction, Emil. Very helpful. And so now I just want to give some practical examples by way of illustration. For people to think about when it looked like God was failing, but in reality he had exactly his own purpose and his plan. So the first thing I can think of is bow, knee, Baal. Why did I put new? I meant knee. First Kings 19:18 and Romans 11:4. God did not reject his people, whom he foreknew. Don't you know what the scripture says in the passage about Elijah, how he appealed to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars. I'm the only one left. They're trying to kill me. What was God's answer to him? I have reserved for myself 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. And maybe I go to the actual verse. 1 Kings 19:18. The Lord said to him, go back the way you came, go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel. And anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel, Meholah, and succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death anyone who escaped the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death anyone who escapes the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him. So I'm going to do 1 Kings 19, 14, and 18. 1 Kings 19, 14, and 18. And he's only one example. There's been plenty of times down through salvation history where it looked hopeless. It looked hopeless. When Jesus was crucified, all of his disciples ran and hid. It looked hopeless. They were terrified. All of those things. And then Jesus comes to them. We had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel, and what is more, it's the third day since all of this took place. In addition, they couldn't find his body. And Jesus teaches them. And they begin to learn, no, your Savior is risen. Very, very important in salvation history and something they missed. Emil on Mixer says, I think a lot of younger people are having trouble with representation of Christian faith because the U.S. presidency is still seen as a major influence. And on the one hand, we see a very faithful VP in Mike Pence, but we also see him side by side with Trump, who sleeps around with prostitutes and brags about both sexual assault and vanity, his golden apartment. So for many younger people, it's like, is this really the faith we believe in? It's a big trial. Emil, very good point, and you're right, I think that doesn't help. The identification of Christianity with conservative values and ideals and with the Republican right for a long time has conflated the two, right? Even though Christianity isn't necessarily coterminous with the religious right, they've become conflated, and so when the right does something that seems unbiblical or immoral, people think that it's Christians who are doing that sort of thing, and they're rebelling against it and turning away and running from it in the opposite direction. So I think you're right about that, Emil. It's very, very difficult, and how can we as Christians today present Christianity in such a way that it is still compelling, but also demonstrates that we recognize the current moral situation that we find ourselves in America? I think that's going to be one of the challenges for us as Christians going forward here in America. Very, very good question. I'm glad you came in and started interacting, Emil. I've not seen you on here before, but you bring up a lot of good ideas, and I'm very encouraged by interacting with you. I enjoyed a lot. Thanks for sharing. So Jesus crucified. And this is, I could do Luke 24, I guess. And then I think we could even go to near modern day stuff, like Middle Ages. Well, let's go pre-Reformation. Indulgences being offered, etc. That also seemed like a dark period in redemptive history, and yet God had a plan for it, and we came out of it stronger. And the whole point I'm going to be trying to make here, guys, is look, God has had a plan for America up until now, and we need to trust that He has a plan for the future, even if things look grim, right? And again, I'm not necessarily saying I believe that, but I think a lot of people in my congregation do. And so that's me trying to kind of appeal to them and get them to see that I understand their situation and where they're coming from. And let's see, I had an encouragement earlier from Kat Hap Lee. Kat Hap Lee said to talk about trust compared to other events. And I kind of liked that idea. So these are all examples. And so this trust compared to other events. So just as the disciples had to trust that God was going to provide, maybe I want to speak to physical trust. So what I'm thinking, is on trust I'm going to talk about two ideas. And the first aspect of trust that I'm going to talk about is going to be physical trust. And I'm going to draw out a distinction that God is the God of both the means and the ends. Physical trust. Because in the passage, they're supposed to physically trust in God, and we don't look like we do that. Does that make us less spiritual? Does it make us less Christian? No, we recognize God as both God of means and end. And in today's day and age, He often likes to use us as the means of accomplishing His purpose. There's nothing wrong with that. So I want to talk about that. Then I'll talk about big picture, how can we trust in our time? We seem to be in a post-Christian age. Hey, we need to recognize God is in control, and He has a plan. Here's some examples when things look grim in salvation history, and yet He worked it out. He's continuing to do so today. I think that's a good message. Emil on Mixer says, as someone with a degree in environmental sciences, I see very big trials ahead. On one hand, science is telling me we're headed for a catastrophic collapse that will endanger 2 billion people through famine and acts of God. On the other, we will have to trust the science will be wrong and something good will come by. That's interesting, Emil, and that's an interesting position to find yourself in. That, on the one hand, you recognize the scientific principles that are driving you to that direction, and yet, on the other hand, you're also recognizing your spiritual faith, right? Now, I hesitate to do this, Emil, because I'm very careful about prophecy and things like that. But I believe it's in Matthew 24. Let's see. I'm going to look this up. Something like no flesh on the earth. There we go. Matthew 24:22. It's very interesting. If those days had not been cut short, no one would have survived, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. At that time, if anyone says, "Look, here is Messiah," or "There he is," do not believe it. False messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you ahead of time. Jesus says, there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, never equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. Now, here's all I want to say about this, Emil. This verse gives me confidence that if the human race ever puts itself in a position of catastrophe like you're talking about, that God will cut short the days, i.e. he will step in and intervene. I know that's a large faith idea, and I also want to state that I believe in the means and the end. So as far as we can, we should be doing our best to take care of the environment and the earth and not set ourselves up for catastrophe like that. But I do think, kind of like you described there, we have to trust science will be wrong and good will come by. I do trust and have faith that God will intervene if the human race ever pushes itself too far in this way. It's a very good question, though. V Whimsical on Twitch says, Kumar, get back to work. V Whimsical, I don't know who you're talking to or what you're talking about, but if Kumar's supposed to be working right now, then that's right, he should get back to work. Thanks, V Whimsical. I like that. Okay. So how can we trust? How can we trust? Keep pushing forward with the gospel principles. I think that's how we can actively trust. Do I need another illustration? I think I might. Trust. Parachute. I'll just use a parachute as an example of trust. We trust in a parachute. How do we demonstrate our trust in the parachute? We put it on. So too, we have to live our lives as though we trust in God. It's about action. So I think that's good. Final point here is on repentance. Not repentance, is on the principles. And we've got 3 principles. What are these 3 principles? They're in verse 10, 11, and 12. Rafe, I'm going to take away your sermon stuff because now it's getting my way. Alright, in verse 10 we have some principles that are given for us. Let's check those out. Mark 6:10. Whenever you enter a house, stay there until you leave that town. Principle 1. Build strong community/relationships. That's lesson number 1 I want to teach. And I'll prove this with verse 10. Lesson number 2, found in verse 11, is what I'll call don't cast your pearls before swine. If any place will not welcome you or listen to you, leave that place and shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them. Don't cast your... why is Uplay updating? I didn't ask it to. Don't cast your pearls before swine. Is, again, lesson 2. And it's found in verse 11. Rafe says, okay, I have leftover Jason's Deli now. Rafe, that is good. That sounds delicious. And just the right snack that one would need to keep cranking along. I hope you got down everything before, Rafe, because I deleted all the notes I had for your sermon. Apologies. Emil on Mixer says, but what if our destruction of the environment is actually the trial, and supporting anti-science leaders is what will bring the wrath of God equal to ancient times? Would it be wrong for God to punish us in equal measures to our destruction of God's creatures? We have destroyed 90% of sea creatures. It's interesting, Emil. First of all, you're talking about a lot of stuff that I'm not that familiar with, so I just take my comments with a grain of salt, right? I don't know that much about all this. The first thing I would say in regards to this is God has given us dominion over the earth. It's our domain, and we're the rulers of it. Genesis 1. God makes man in his image. Verse 26, then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea, and the birds in the sky, over livestock and all the wild animals, over all creatures that move along the ground. God has given it to us to rule over the sea and the fish in it, right? That is our domain. That's what we're supposed to do as human beings. And so there's a sense in which we have a right to rule over the sea. Now, if we're doing it poorly, that's not good. And God, I think, would have something to say about that, right? But he did give us right to rule over the sea, right? And the sky, livestock, all of those things. So that's one important thing. The other thing that comes to mind is Genesis 6. Genesis 6, God floods the entire earth because he is really mad at mankind. But an interesting thing happens, and he gives the rainbow in chapter 8. So Noah came out together with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives. All the animals and all the creatures that move along the ground and all the birds, everything that moves on the land, came out of the ark, one kind after another. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord God, taking some of the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed them. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood, and never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. As long as the earth endures, these things will never cease. And then God gives the rainbow, right? He says that is his picture or his image of his relationship with us, that he is not going to destroy the earth. It takes a leap to go here, but I partially take that to mean that God's also going to look out for us to such an extent that he won't let that happen, right? And so here it says the Lord won't do this, but I also partially think he won't let us do it to ourselves. Again, that's faith. I don't know that for sure, but that's how I feel about it, right? And so those are the two things that come to mind. What if the trial is supporting anti-science leaders and that will bring wrath? It might. It might, Emil. And I don't have an answer for that. That might be the case. I don't know that for sure, and it's a good question. Again, all we can do is make the best decisions with the information that we have available to us, right? And like you said, this is information that's available to us, so we better utilize it to make good decisions. Rafe on YouTube says, I will not be able to start developing that outline until tomorrow. Questions. I should be able to comment on all my text, right? Or just select parts? That's up to you, Rafe. The one thing I have found is that it's impossible and also exhausting to your congregation if you try to be exhaustive with the text. If you try to take out every single point, every single verse, and go into depth about it, you're going to have too much material and you're going to be giving too much information. So I tend to just pick the big concepts, the big pictures out of the text and preach on them. That said, it's usually helpful to people if you can touch on most of the verses, right? So what I would say in your case is you probably want to treat each of the verses with the level of depth that they should be given. So you say an elder must be blameless, faithful to his wife. So there's an idea. Now, you could go into a ton of detail on what the Greek is. Like here it says blameless. What is that? And you could tell everybody blameless means blameless in the Greek is anegkletos, anegkletos. And then you might go to your BDAG, right? So you'll grab anegkletos and you'll take it, go to the lemma, and you'll go to your BDAG and you'll read here in your lexicon, blameless, irreproachable of Christians in general, who will establish you as blameless in the day of the Lord. And so you'll say blameless means irreproachable, right? And so then you'll give all these idea about what does it mean to be irreproachable. And you could go in all this detail, and you could spend 10 minutes talking about a single word, right? And I've seen a lot of pastors do that, and I find that to be not very helpful to your people. Instead, I think it's a lot more helpful if you summarize some of these ideas into big picture thoughts, right? And you might say, what does it mean to be blameless? Well, blamelessness carries the idea of being above reproach. Some translations might even read that, or you're irreproachable. Well, what does that mean? That means generally that unbelievers or believers alike, when they look on at us from society, they should see us as good citizens. See? And then you can immediately jump to application. What would make you a good citizen in today's day and age? And you can start going to application and you can start giving illustrations, right? Rather than spending tons and tons of time in the Greek and all of that stuff, you instead jump quickly to the idea of what it means, and then you tell people how they can act that out in their lives, right? I think that's what's most helpful for people. And the hard part is you have lots of different verses to go to, right? That's just blameless. You also have faithful to his wife. What does that mean? Man whose children are not open to the charge of wild and disobedient. Overseer manages God's household, not overbearing, not quick-tempered, not given to drunkenness, right? There's so much material you could go into. And what I would do is instead try to summarize through generally speaking, what does not overbearing, not quick-tempered, and not given to drunkenness mean? How could you summarize that into a single idea? Or maybe a couple small ideas. That's kind of what I would do. Rafe says, I only need 30 minutes worth. Exactly, Rafe. So don't go into all these details on all of these separate things. And you might skip a couple, right? You might say, in your head, you might say blameless is fairly straightforward, and I don't need to give a ton of detail on that one. But it's this one, not pursuing dishonest gain. That's the one my people really need to know what that means. And so let me go into the details on that. You're going to have to pick and choose a little bit what you spend your time on. Emil on Mixer says, I understand that part. And that's the scary part. We are his image of destruction. May he not use his dominion over us to destroy us in equal measures, because science is telling us almost all will be destroyed. God will not destroy us all, but 90% of us. That's what science tells me. It's an interesting corollary, Emil. Again, the Bible doesn't have a lot to say on that topic, and so I'm hesitant to go into it with a lot of depth because I don't have as much information. But yeah, it's a good point, and we need to think about that. Again, we're called to be stewards of the earth and to honor God with how we live in our lives and in society today. So you have legitimate concerns, Emil, and they're things that we should be concerned about. On Twitch, I'm Redshift says, who are you talking to? Redshift, welcome. I'm glad you're joining me. Now, I multi-stream Redshift, so I am currently on Twitch, YouTube, Facebook, and Mixer. I'm currently talking to 2 different people, Redshift. I'm talking to Rafe Anderson, who is with me on YouTube, because he is doing some sermon preparation on the book of Titus, chapter 1. And so I'm talking with him, and the other person I'm talking with right now is on Mixer, and that is Emil L. on Mixer. He's had a lot of questions surrounding how God is going to judge us based on environmental things and situations. And so that's who I'm talking to, Redshift. Rafe on YouTube says, okay, last question. How would I transition from point 1, elders are God's appointed means, verse 5, to point 2, Christians are to follow their example? Any ideas? Let's look at that. I would do something like this, Rafe. You've already established verse 5, right? You've said, this is what God wants us to do, this is why he wants us to do it, etc., right? So you've already established verse 5. The way I would transition into the rest is I would say something along these lines. And then Paul gives a long list to Titus about the sorts of characteristics and qualities that elders should have. How is that relevant to Paul asking Titus to set up churches? Well, it's relevant because Paul, in giving these characteristics and qualities of these elders, is also implicitly giving characteristics and qualities that he wants the churches as a whole to have. You see, churches take on the characteristics and qualities of their leaders. Churches and church members follow in the footsteps of their leaders. As their leaders go, so the congregation goes. And in that sense, I think Paul is also very concerned about how our leadership is set up, because it's going to affect our congregations. And it's at that point that you could say, the fact of the matter is the Bible says that Christians are supposed to follow the example of their leaders, and that is implicit here. Something like that I think would help a lot, Rafe. Rafe says, oh wow, that is brilliant, thank you so much. No problem, brother, and I hope you can get some good ideas from that. Transitions are important, and I'm glad you're thinking about them, because linking those texts together is very, very helpful for people. Redshift says, oh, have you ever debated with people? I have debated with people, Redshift. I've done several informal debates, and I actually did a formal debate way, way back in the day when I first became a Christian. I don't think it's on YouTube. It was way back, I'm talking 10, 11 years ago, I did a debate. Let's see if I can find something. Yeah, I cannot find anything, Redshift. I did a formal debate way back in the day on basically, can we trust the Bible? And it was a very, very good debate. Again, way, way back in the day. And it was interesting. I enjoyed it. I like debating, but I haven't done it in a while. I've done it before, and I've done plenty of informal debates since then. But I've not done formal debates except for that one a while back. So I've only done one formal debate. Good question. Yeah, I like debating. I don't know if you know who James White is. I like watching some of his debates and other debates as well. Redshift says, what arguments do you like for God? So, I am, when it comes to apologetics, I am a presuppositionalist, right? And so I believe in the transcendental argument for the existence of God. That I think is the strongest one. And the argument essentially says this, Redshift. Without God, without the existence of God, there's no reason to believe anything at all, right? There's no reason for proof itself. Proof itself falls apart if you don't believe in God, right? So that's my favorite argument for the existence of God, the transcendental argument. And I'll try to show it to you briefly here in a second. I also think moral arguments for the existence of God are powerful because we're all moral beings. So let's go into this. So I like the transcendental argument for the existence of God. and I like the moral arguments for the existence of God. Redshift says, I'm very aware of it. Perfect, so I don't have to go into all of that. He says, is this Greg Bonson's version or Matt Slick? I follow Greg Bonson more than Matt Slick, but yeah, those are the ideas. The moral argument is something put forth by John Frame that I really appreciate in his books on the topic as well. Redshift, if you don't mind, I'm going to go into a little more detail on the transcendental argument, because Emil is asking how so. I don't understand how that's an argument. So I am going to go into the transcendental argument. Let's see. Redshift says it's a circular argument. It definitely has its problems. Sure, Redshift, and all worldviews that go to their foundations are circular. So, if you believe that logic is the absolute, then you're going to have to prove that logically. If you believe that science is the absolute, you're going to have to use science to prove it. All fundamental belief systems, when you boil them down to their base principle, are circular. So, yeah, that's circularity. It's a kind of circularity, but they're all circular. No, they are, Redshift. Redshift says some aren't circular. Every single worldview, if you boil it down to its absolute, is circular. So, let's see if transcendental. Oh, here you go. Circularity is one's philosophical system is just another name for consistency in outlook throughout one system. That is, one starting point and final conclusion cohere with each other. Here it is more fully explained. The circularity of a transcendental argument is not at all the same as the fallacious circularity of an argument in which the conclusion is a restatement in one form or another of its premises. Rather, it is the circularity involved in a coherent theory where all parts are consistent with or assume each other, and which is required when one reasons about preconditions for reasoning. Its circles are destructive of human thought, i.e. vicious and futile endeavors. So, there you go, Redshift. So, Emil, I'm going to go into what the transcendental argument is. Man, I'm liking this music. And let's go heading text and large text. Here we go. Baker Encyclopedia of Christian Apologetics. Perfect. The transcendental argument. Let me show you this, Emil. The transcendental argument is used by some presuppositional apologists to demonstrate the truth of Christianity. It is patterned after Immanuel Kant's reasoning for critique and pure reason. A transcendental argument is neither deductive nor inductive. It's more reductive, arguing back to the necessary preconditions of something being the case. As used by presuppositional apologetics, the transcendental argument affirms that, in order to make sense of the world, it is necessary to postulate the existence of the triune God as revealed in the Bible. This argument is employed by Van Til and in modified form by Francis Schaeffer. Van Til's thought is rooted in Dewey Weird, who got it from Kant. He goes on into more detail. It's Emil, the idea goes like this. What would have to be true for our minds to be able to reason and think clearly about truth? What would have to be true in order for that to be true? That's part of the idea behind the transcendental argument for the existence of God, right? And the conclusion, or maybe it's a premise, I don't know, but the idea that it drives at is that at its foundation, the Bible would have to be true, the God of the Bible would have to exist in order for all of those other things to be true, right? Now, Redshift, if you're interested, part of what I don't like necessarily the transcendental argument as given, but the principle behind the transcendental argument is what's really compelling to me. And what I mean is this, Redshift. I look at the world around me, and I ask myself this: what worldview makes the most sense of the world that I live in? Right? That's the question I ask myself, Redshift. And this is compelling for me. It doesn't have to be compelling for you, that's fine. But when I look at the world around me, which worldview can make the most sense of it? And for me, that is, no questions asked, Christianity. Christianity makes the most sense of the world around me. So one example that I often give is that the world is made up of people. And people are simultaneously good. I see a lot of good people. And then people are also simultaneously evil, right? There are a lot of evil people in the world. What worldview can account for the fact that people are both good and evil? Which worldview makes the most sense of that? And I think the Christian doctrine of original sin and the Christian doctrine of being made in the image of God, boom, put together, make the most sense of why people are simultaneously good and evil. I think that make sense of it, and the Bible gives me that. And so that gives me more confidence in the Bible and what the Bible has to say. And then I read other things in the Bible where it talks about different aspects. And so, for example, the Bible talks about a global flood. Well, there's a lot of geologic evidence that we have had a global flood, and not only that, a lot of ancient cultures down through society have talked about a flood as well. What worldview can make sense of the fact that there seems to have been a catastrophic flood in our history? Oh, the Bible talks about that, therefore Christianity seems to go in that direction as well. Those are the things that I find compelling, Redshift. If you don't find them compelling, that's fine. But those are the things that I find compelling. So it's not the transcendental argument as given that I find compelling, but it's the principles that the transcendental argument is pointing at that encourage me that those are the direction I should go. Rafe Fanner says, Bonson and Frame are so great. I agree 1,000,000%, Rafe. Very, very influential on my faith. Emil says, science isn't circular other than having a complete explanation. In that sense, science's theories are currently non-circular because some key parts are missing. So let me address that first. Science isn't circular other than having a complete explanation. You assume... So, I'll give you an example, Emil. Have you read any David Hume? I think it's Critique of Pure Reason. Have you read any Hume, Emil? Hume destroys the idea of cause and effect. Absolutely eviscerates it if you're trying to analyze it from purely scientific principles. And as the first imagination or invention of a particular effect in all natural operations is arbitrary, where we consult not experience, so must we also esteem the supposed tie or connection between cause and effect, which binds them together and renders it impossible that any other effect could result from the operation of the cause. When I see, for instance, a billiard ball moving in a straight line towards another, even suppose motion in the second ball should be, by accident, be suggested to me as the result of their contact or impulse, may I not conceive that 100 different events might follow as well from that cause? May not both these balls remain at absolute rest? May not the first ball return in a straight line or leap off from the second, or in any line or in any direction? All these suppositions are consistent and conceivable within pure science. Why then should we give preference to the one which is no more consistent or conceivable than the rest? All our reasonings a priori will never be able to show us any foundation for this preference. And Hume's argument is logical, it's consistent, and it's sound, right? If you go through Hume's argument in general, he's essentially saying that if you go based purely on scientific principles, that you can never reason to effect from cause. You have to actually jump to effect from cause. And again, this is recognized among plenty of philosophers today. Cause and effect is not the sort of thing that science can prove for us. Science assumes cause and effect to be true in order for it to function well and properly. Otherwise, you can't do science. Consistency within nature, the fact that this cause always produces this effect, takes an assumption, a scientific-based assumption, which is a type of circularity, which Redshift claimed that I held to earlier when I appealed to the transcendental argument, right? It's the same type of circularity in order to assume science in order to prove science, right? And my whole point is not that this is bad or wrong, or that Hume is bad or wrong. My whole point is that it's not any more circular to assume the foundation of the Bible in terms of trying to prove its truth than it is to assume cause and effect in terms of pursuing science. We both make assumptions in those regards. Science cannot proceed unless it assumes cause and effect. Science cannot proceed at all unless it assumes the uniformity of nature, both, again, which philosophically Hume eviscerated. And so too, Christianity, if it appeals to a transcendental truth or a transcendental argument, it's making those same base assumptions. They're circular, fine, but they are a type of circularity in which all worldviews must appeal to. Let me show you Frame and his knowledge of God. For what it's worth, Redshift, you brought up the issues of arguments or proofs for the existence of God. I don't know that you're going to find any of these compelling, and frankly, I don't care. It's not any sort of thing where I believe that this is the definitive argument. This is what you're going to have to believe. All arguments take assumptions. All arguments take worldviews into account. And all arguments have assumed beliefs and presuppositions that they follow. And provided you can step in and grant some of those presuppositions, then you can see the logical consistency of the arguments themselves. But I've never found them compelling. If you come in here and tell me, provide you an argument for the existence of God, fine, I do it. And you're saying, oh, it's circular, I don't agree with it. Well, fine. You find it circular and you don't agree with it? Guess what? Science, for science's pure sake, I find circular and I don't agree with it. Hume, again, eviscerated cause and effect, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend that he didn't. So, all worldviews have to assume some sort of circularity when they proceed forward. That's if they're going to get off the ground at all. Let's see. Frame says circular near foundation. Let's see what he's got. Nothing. Let's try absolute. Nothing. I know he talks about this. Let's just try circularity. Right here, circularity. Thus we face a major problem. Since circular arguments are usually considered to be fallacious, how can the Christian justify circularity in his argument for Christianity? First, there's no alternative to circularity. Criticism is effective only when the critic can suggest a better way, but there is no alternative to circularity. First, allegiance to our Lord demands that we be loyal to Him, even when we are seeking to justify our assertions about Him. We cannot abandon our covenant commitment to escape the charge of circularity. This is a Christian argument. You don't have to listen to this at all. Second, no system can avoid circularity because all systems, as we have seen, non-Christian as well as Christian, are based on presuppositions that control their epistemologies, argumentation, and use of of evidence. Thus, a rationalist can only prove the primacy of reason by using a rational argument. An empiricist can only prove the primacy of sense experience only by some kind of appeal to sense experience. A Muslim can only prove the primacy of the Quran by appealing to the Quran. But if all systems are circular in this way, then circularity can hardly be urged against Christianity. The critic will inevitably be just as guilty of circularity as the Christian is. And that's the position I think you're in, no matter what argument you try to make for any foundation redshift. Emil says his argument is basically saying he doesn't know enough. He's not considering air friction, friction between materials, density of materials, etc., etc. Emil says science currently works with statistical odds. In most scenarios, science has a 99.99% prediction when done with competent people. In other scenarios, scientists have a lot less knowledge, so they lay out plausible scenarios and try to refine their models until they lean closer to the 99.99%. Yes, Emil, but they make assumptions that betray their conclusions. Here's how science proceeds. Science assumes the uniformity of nature and cause and effect. Those things are true, right? They have to be true because we get to 99.99%. So nature is uniform and cause and effect are true. But the problem with our day and age, this is actually a problem in a lot of arenas. The problem in our day and age is that people are specialists in everything they do. Everybody specializes more and more. Nobody gets a general broad understanding. And if you're going to assume cause and effect, and if you're going to assume uniformity of nature, you are doing so in a philosophically bankrupt system, right? If you're going to also continue to remain in an atheistic framework or things like that. Hume, an atheist, absolutely destroyed cause and effect from a philosophical framework. So you might be alone over here as a scientist and saying, look, science says 99.99% that if it assumes nature is uniform and if it assumes that cause and effect are true, that 99.99% of the time we get the same results. Right, but you're making two assumptions. You're assuming the uniformity of nature, you're assuming cause and effect are true. And here's my proof for the existence of God, Redshift. My proof is that which system, which worldview can account for the fact that nature is uniform and can account for the fact that cause and effect exist. Because from atheistic presuppositions, Hume destroys it. In a word, then, every effect is distinct from its cause. It could not, therefore, be discovered in the cause, and the first invention or conception of it a priori must be entirely arbitrary. That's Hume, an atheist. And even after it is suggested, the conjunction of it with the cause must appear equally arbitrary, since there are always many other effects, which, to reason, must seem fully as consistent and natural. In vain, therefore, should we pretend to determine any single event or infer any cause or effect without the assistance of observation and experience, right? And so he essentially says you can't assume cause and effect, principally speaking, a priori. You can't do it. If that's true, science falls apart because cause and effect must be true in order to do science. So my whole argument, transcendentally speaking, for Redshift or for Emil, is this. We know cause and effect is true. We know that nature is uniform because science works. Now, which worldview makes the most sense of that fact? Which worldview can account for the uniformity of nature? Which worldview says that cause and effect exist? An atheistic worldview doesn't make sense of that, given the origins of the universe and everything else. A Christian worldview, which assumes the Bible, can actually account for cause and effect and can give an appropriate reason for the uniformity of nature. So that's the type of transcendental argument that I find compelling, Redshift. Dylan Holder on YouTube says, he's right, science does rely on assumptions, but it isn't true that all worldviews are circular. Again, let me go back to Doctrine of the Knowledge of God. No system can avoid circularity because all systems, as we have seen, non-Christian as well as Christian, are based on presuppositions that control their epistemologies, argumentation, and use of evidence. Thus, a rationalist can prove the primacy of reason only by using a rational argument. Any form of rationalism, any form, and rationalism isn't popular today because science has become so popular, any form of rationalism has to make a rational argument for its case, therefore being circular. An empiricist can prove the primacy of sense experience only by some kind of appeal to sense experience. If you're going to say that sense experience is the standard on which we are to judge the world, a typical science-based approach, then you are going to have to appeal to sense experience in order to do it. If you don't appeal to sense experience in support of your view of sense experience, then you are saying that there's a greater or deeper foundation than the sense experience itself. Emil on Mixer says, nice talking to you. I have to go back to work, unfortunately. I'm sorry, Emil. I enjoyed chatting with you. I know I might be getting fired up a little bit, but you guys are asking a lot of good questions, and I'm trying to make my case, right? So I appreciate Emil. I appreciate your interaction. Hit follow if you're interested in following me in the future. I try to stream 4 times a week, so we can maybe catch up and talk more in the future. Take care, Emil, and I hope you have good time at work. And so, if you're going to appeal to base principles or foundation principles in a worldview, you're ultimately going to have to appeal to that same principle, which is circular. Circularity restricted. Circularity in a system is properly justified only at one point in an argument for the ultimate criterion. The Christian employs circularity in his argument for Scripture. The rationalist employs circularity in his argument for reason. The empiricist, circularity in his argument for sense experience. But that does not imply that circularity is permissible in other sorts of arguments. Paul wrote 2 Timothy because Paul wrote 2 Timothy is a circular argument whose circularity is not justified. It is possible to argue the Pauline authorship of 2 Timothy on the basis of higher and broader principles than the Pauline authorship of 2 Timothy. Allowing circularity at one point in the system, therefore, does not commit us to allowing circularity at all points. End quote. Emil says, it's okay, and he hits the follow button. Thanks, Emil. Appreciate you follow, and hopefully I can interact with you more in the future. Really enjoyed it. So, you can have an infinite regress of justifications for your epistemology, says Dylan Holder. An infinite regress of justifications for your epistemology. Well, just broadly speaking, Dylan, let me put it out this way. Dylan, can you give me an epistemology in which that's the case? Can you give me an example of an epistemology in which that's the case? Dylan says that only applies to coherentism and foundationalism. And guys, I hate to do it. I hate to do it because I'm having some good interaction with you guys today, but I have to leave shortly. Very, very shortly. I have to drive to an appointment. Dylan says you can use it for any worldview. No, give me a specific epistemology that isn't circular in its foundational principles. Rafe says bye-bye. Thanks, Rafe. I enjoyed interacting with you today. I hope you made some good progress on your sermon, and we can chat more in the future on this stuff. Again, I think that your sermon's going to go well. I think you've got some good ideas for that. Infinitism. And I think that's what Redshift was talking about earlier, is infinitism. Baronet. Infinite series of causes. Suggestion of an infinite series is only raised by the horizontal Kalam form of the cosmological argument. In the vertical form, blah blah blah, the very first cause outside of beings who exist is actually actualized, blah blah blah. Mathematically, infinite series are possible, but not actual ones. The former are abstract, the latter concrete. It's possible having an infinite number of points in one line. Infinitism. Epistemological infinitism. Since Gettier, knowledge is no longer widely accepted as meaning justified true belief. Oops. Here we go. Traditional theories of justification, foundational and coherentism, are indeed some philosophers who consider an infinite regress not a valid justification. In their view, if A is justified B, 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 C, So Dylan, is the idea that if somebody asks you for your justification for a belief, you just go to another belief and you just keep going down for another belief and you don't have to have an ultimate foundation? Is that the idea broadly? That's kind of what I'm understanding here. Something like that, says Dylan. Okay. But my whole thing would be, pragmatically speaking, it seems like an opportunity to be arbitrary. That's what it seems like to me. I know he talks about arbitrariness here. Let's see. Principle of avoiding arbitrariness. For all x, if a person S has a justification for x, there is some reason R1 available to S for x, and there is some reason R2 available to S for R1, etc. PA says that in order to avoid arbitrariness, for any proposition X to be justified in an epistemological agent, there must be some reason R available for the agent. This reason will in turn require the same structure of justification, and so on ad infinitum. Foundational theorists can only avoid arbitrariness by claiming that some propositions are self-justified. Okay, so that's what I was essentially saying. So the theory of epistemology that I was putting forth before was foundationalist, right, Dylan? But if a proposition is its own justification, that's circular. And my argument was, I assumed foundationalism. If I get this right, I assumed foundationalism, Dylan. And when I assumed foundationalism, therefore, I argued that everything had to appeal to circularity in some way, shape, or form. Does that sound correct? Yeah, that's right. Okay. So, if foundationalism isn't true... See, here's the problem, Dylan. I have... In my thinking about all these things, I have found foundationalism to be self-evident, if that makes sense. And I know you don't have those things, but like I've assumed that everybody else is somewhat foundationalist in terms of their argumentation, right? Yeah, I don't have time to go into this in depth, Dylan, but this is very interesting. I'm glad you brought it to my attention. It feels like philosophical or epistemological games so that we can be arbitrary. That's what it feels like. I'm not saying that's what it is, right? But that's what it feels like to me. In order to avoid arbitrariness, yeah, ad infinitum. Ad infinitum. How would you ever, Dylan, just real quick, I have to go, I really do. How would you ever refute a belief that is nested within epistemological infinitism? Just any belief that's nested in there, right? Because the way it goes is you just go down along the line. There's always a belief, and then there's a rationalization for the belief. Let's say you found a belief in there. How would you ever refute one of them? If you demonstrated a contradiction, they could change R1, right? They have a justification for X. If for all Y, if Y is the evidential ancestry for X and S, then X is not the evidential blah, blah, blah. You could just change your R1. For all X, if a person S has justification for X, there is some reason R1 available to S for X, right? So, you demonstrate a contradiction, okay? You demonstrate a contradiction. They could change their R1. Oh, it's not founded in that, it's founded in this. And if you refute that one, they could say it's founded in this. If you refute that one, they could say it's founded in this. See what I'm getting at? I'll tell you what, this music has been good on this one since I changed the tag. I'm digging it. Dylan says that's still going to work against them. Dylan, give me a follow or a subscribe or whatever. And I don't know if Redshift is still around. Redshift could do the same. I want to interact more on this topic. I find it very, very interesting. Dylan says, I'm not sure what you mean. I don't have time, Dylan. I should have left 10 minutes ago. I don't have time to go into the detail of what's messing me up on this one. But I'm very interested in it. Hit me a follow or a subscribe. And again, Redshift, if you're still there, go ahead and shoot me a follow. And I'd like to interact more on this topic in the future. This is helpful for me. I wasn't aware of this. I wasn't aware of foundationalism or infinitism or any of these things, or coherentism. So I'm still learning. Dylan says he's subbed. Thank you, Dylan. I appreciate that, and I appreciate you bringing this to my light. I should be streaming tomorrow, and I can interact with more on this stuff at that point. Really appreciate interacting with you guys today. Again, I'm so sorry I have to go, but I got an appointment. I have to take off. Really enjoyed you guys. I hope you have a great Friday. I hope you have a great weekend, a great Saturday. God bless. Talk to you guys later. Bye now.